Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Mel V, coming to you live from CCN headquarters here in Portugal. It is great to be with you, as always, this Wednesday evening. And it is 7 p.m. GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. And we are absolutely delighted to once again be joined by Dan Roodt and, of course, our co-host and most esteemed colleague, Karin Smith, who will be taking this interview through to a great end. And hopefully we'll learn a bit more today, because so much has been going on behind the scenes. Lots to talk about. So make sure you stay tuned. All right. Big welcome, Dan. Thank you for coming back to speak to us.
Well, it's a pleasure, Mel. It's nice to be seeing you all again online.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I'd just like to do a little bit of your bio for people, the few people who don't know who you are. So Dan Roodt is our guest today, and we brought him on again because the previous time we had him on, we had some video and audio problems. And Dan has a great insight into South African affairs, is an author, a columnist. He's founded Prague.org. And he is well able to talk about everything South African. So we thought we would bring him back on because we missed half of what he had to say last time, which is not a good thing. Dan, I have recently been reading an article that you wrote for the American Renaissance Party, a letter from South Africa. You wrote it in April of this year, and it's very relevant today. The article is about mostly white liberals in South Africa. Dan said that we had to fight the liberals in their own ranks, some Afrikaners, but until recently, mostly wealthy, decadent English speakers in Johannesburg and Cape Town, who never felt any real patriotism or connection with our country. He says JBM Hertzog, a fine prime minister from the first half of the 20th century, described them as foreign fortune seekers. These days, of course, many of these people and the media they control have turned virulently anti-white and anti-Afrikaner and are agitating side by side with ideologically crazed Marxist blacks to turn South Africa into just another African country. Now, those words hit home to me, Dan, very, very hard, because Nell and I are both English-speaking South Africans. We can hardly be called liberals. I think for myself, I'm very conservative, would not like to see a new world order in place, would fight it till our last breath, although we would like to see universal peace and people living in peace and harmony with their environment. So if you could extrapolate a bit on that article, it would be fabulous.
Well, yes. I haven't recently read it, of course, but I can more or less remember what I wrote there. But if you look at South African history, people said, obviously, we started settling here in the 17th century, and I think in the 18th century, there were towards the end of the 18th century, there were about 40,000 white people in South Africa. After that, the British settlers came in 1820. And I think in those days, there was quite a good relationship between the two white groups in South Africa, the newly arrived British settlers and the more established Dutch settlers, or they were starting to call themselves Afrikaners from when was it, about early 1700s, in fact. But you had, I think, particularly after the discovery of diamonds and gold, you had a sort of an influx, yes, of these people that Herzog called the foreign fortune seekers. And they've always maintained their ties to Britain and to London and the financial world in London. And they've never really, adopted a kind of South African identity or nation. I mean, they may have the nationality, some of them, but a lot of them have also kept foreign passports and so on. And they've been the ones who have been most against the local population all along, and they've cooperated with all these foreigners to actually boycott us and to smear us, to vilify us and to call us racists and so on. And I think those people, and unfortunately, they've got a lot of influence in South Africa. They've got a lot of media pull, and I think they, in certain businesses, they also control, they used to be quite powerful in the mining industry. But I think that influence has diminished a little bit. But yeah, in I think possibly these days in banking, they might have some influence. If I think of, for example, all the controversies that we've seen over the last year or two around racial issues in South Africa. And then you've got somebody, I mean, for example, there was the statement by Chris Hart, who is an economist at Standard Bank, and he said that a lot of the members of the black elite had a sense of entitlement in South Africa. And I think no one can really argue with that. But he was fired from his job. He was forced to resign by this Chabalala character who's the chairman of Standard Bank. So obviously, they've got all their people in certain industries such as banking and in the media and so on. And they, dictate to a large extent what happens in South Africa. They're adamant about affirmative action and the so-called black economic empowerment. And yeah, I think they've done us a lot of damage, in the past, and it continues in the present. And a lot of the confusion that you find in South Africa is really their fault, because they are forever, creating these illusions about what's possible in South Africa and what isn't. And they're very much anti-white as well. I mean, they're sort of driving these campaigns to, to discredit white people and to idealize black people and Africans and so on. I mean, they've even gone so far as to actually claim that life in South Africa was much better before white people came to the country. Even in those days when blacks were living under very primitive conditions without any form of science or medicine or education. I mean, they're even claiming that was far superior to the sort of industrial country that we've got at the moment.
Yes, and that has become a really, really big problem in South Africa, because history is being turned on its head by this kind of thing. You also wrote an article about the history book we should be using, and the history books we should not be using, which I found very interesting as well. In fact, I try and read all your articles because I learned so much from them that I couldn't possibly know otherwise. But the white liberals, you say also in that article that U.S. liberals are European socialists and believe in a post-racial brown future. Essentially, they want us to be physically absorbed by the black population and culturally absorbed by global American culture. And I find that so true, because if you look at Europe at the moment, Europe is being overrun by brown people. And within a couple of years, will it even be white, Dan? Will there be a white identity worldwide even?
Yes, well, I think, I don't know whether you've read that book by Jean Raspail called The Camp of the Saints. That is quite famous about 20 years ago or so. But it's still being read all over the world. I think it was sort of an allegory of the fall of Western civilization when a lot of third world immigrants overran France. It was sort of a fantasy he wrote, a kind of dystopian fantasy he wrote in the early 1970s. Very interesting French author, Jean Raspail. And that's more really, I mean, and the uncanny thing is that Jean Raspail's prophecy in the camp of the saints is actually happening today, as you say. You know, you've got all these brown people arriving from all over the world, and they're just getting onto little boats and crossing the Mediterranean and, occupying Europe. A lot of people are talking about occupation. There's a French author, another French author, a younger one, is about the same age as me. He, by the name of Renaud Camus, and he coined this phrase, the great replacement, or in French, le grand remplacement. And I think he's hit the nail on the head. They really want to replace the population of Europe with another population. And there are elements of that in South Africa too. If you see in companies and in the courts and everywhere, there's this notion that all whites have to be replaced by people of color. And I think that's part of the ideology of our time, that people of European descent should be replaced by others in a grand replacement or a great replacement. And there are certainly elements of that now in Europe. You can see it happening. And the socialists, who are not very popular anymore, they see these new arrivals as potential supporters and voters, and they of course welcome them in Europe. And if you see how the voting patterns go in Europe, in France, for example, all of the immigrants vote for the Socialist Party or the left-wing parties. None of them vote for the right or even the center right. So they've got a vested interest in getting more and more immigrants who will represent socialist voters.
Dan, at the moment in America, that is a really big subject because President Trump is trying to close our borders and prevent these people from coming in just willy-nilly, by their thousands. And there's a huge democratic movement against that because, as you say, they vote Democrat. Socialists, they vote that way. So it's a wonderful way to increase their numbers. But it seems to me to be a very short-sighted thing to do because, all right, in the short term, you get the vote and you stay in power. But we're all going to become brown. So how does that help you in the long run? It wipes out our people. And we're not allowed to be proud of being white. We're not allowed to be... nothing must be white orientated because then you're a racist. So life just becomes increasingly difficult all over the world. I mean, in Sweden, they even said that there is no such thing as a Swedish identity, which is ridiculous because every nation has an identity. The Boer nation has their own very strong identity.
Yeah, well, I've been to Sweden twice, and it struck me that Swedes do have a very specific character and even appearance. 90% of the people have blue eyes, and they've got certain facial morphology and so on, and you can immediately recognize a person as a Swede, so as an ethnic Swede. So the notion that they should simply disappear, I mean, it seems tragic. People are talking about saving the rhino and saving the gorilla and so on. But, well, what about all these so-called white tribes or white nations who all have certain specific characteristics and a certain beauty and culture about them. And, does anyone have the right to just destroy that and, you know, yeah, uh, have those people replaced in this great replacement that Renaud Camus talks about?
I've read some of Camus, and although he's quite difficult to read, he is a remarkably wise and intelligent person. Dan, so now the nationalist uprisings that are slowly happening all over the world, which seem to me to be a good thing, because nation states, from my point of view, need to exist to protect your identity. And I think it's special to have, Mel and I, and you are South Africans, we have a South African identity. It's part of our bone structure, literally. And then you have people, American. I mean, I when I first came to America, the American pride in who they are, the USA that happens.
Yes. Very,
it's important. It is important because it gives you a grounding in who you are, where you belong, what your history is. If we wipe all that away and forget about nation states, is there a possibility of just becoming some amorphous group? Because I don't see that happening. In South Africa, it's been proven that it doesn't work. So is it going to work internationally?
Well, I don't think so, because, even Angela Merkel, who, threw open the borders of Germany at one point. I mean, she's also on record as saying that multiculturalism has failed in Germany. And I think it's failed in Europe. It's failed in South Africa. I mean, it causes a lot more conflict than it actually solves. People have this idea, this sort of melting pot idea that goes back to, ironically, another Swedish person or economist, Gunnar Myrdal, who wrote a book in the 1940s, An American Dilemma. And he had this notion that people should just mix and there will be this melting pot, and then eventually people will get on together and so on. But it hasn't worked that way. It hasn't created harmony. It's created more conflict than anything else. As soon as you mix people up, then, you've got ethnic conflict coming to the fore. We've seen it in Africa as well, where people have actually slaughtered one another, the various African tribes. And, you've also got much more racial conflict now in South Africa in the so-called integrated society than before. And there's much more hatred and, resentment among the various groups. If you had exactly the same experience in the USA, the old South, which was segregated, there was great, there was, I mean, people got on fairly well, and blacks and whites, there wasn't hatred between blacks and whites in the old South. Whereas now, of course, in the USA, you've got extreme enmity and animosity between groups. They shoot one another. They insult one another all the time. There's a lot of conflict. Sorry, excuse me for sneezing. And you see the exact same thing happening in Europe. The Arabs in Europe, they very much resent the indigenous European population. There's and you've got the same sort of reaction from Europeans themselves, and some of the more extreme groups, they're calling for conflict between the various ethnic groups in Europe. So yes, I think we should all agree with Mrs. Merkel and that multiculturalism has failed and that we need a new model um, to solve the ethnic problems in the world of today. But I think talking about nationalism, I think it goes a lot deeper than the sort of spontaneous affirmation of people's identities that one is seeing all over the world now. When I was in Sweden last year, I actually met up with some young people from the Baltic states, from Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia and so on, and they were extremely nationalistic. They go on these kind of nocturnal um, marches where they march with torches by torchlight and so on, thousands of them. And I think that's a result of their identities having been repressed during the Soviet era when they were part of the Soviet Union, and now that they're free almost by accident, because I think it was in the American interest to actually support their independence and their self-determination. So you've got these three small countries that became independent in the early 90s, and they've really enjoyed their freedom and their independence. But there's a sort of another level apart from the kind of emotional or even ethnic level. There's sort of an intellectual rediscovery of the thought of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, because after the Second World War, everything to do with nationalism was extremely discredited, and there was almost a taboo against it. You weren't allowed to even discuss the topic. And a lot of the very interesting authors from the early 20th century were just not reprinted or studied or anything like that. So, and now all of that, there's a rediscovery of all of that thinking from that part of history. And for example, I mean, there's a guy, there's some French esoteric thinker. His name escapes me now, but he was quite famous in the early 20th century. And his works are now being reissued by Gallimard, who's the most prestigious French publisher. And I mean, people also later on kind of derided him, even though he studied Oriental religions and so on. But he was also deemed to be a fascist by some people merely because he put such a lot of value, or such a lot of emphasis on national identity and even religious identity, whether it's in the Western context or in the Eastern context. And for that reason, some people thought he was some sort of fascist or proto-fascist, but now he's being republished and discussed and so on. And a lot of that is happening, especially in Europe. But of course, in the United States, there's a whole alt-right movement. So yes, it's a whole different ballgame now. And I saw today there was an interesting tweet too by Martin Bosma, where some left-wing guy said, he was quoting him saying that the left should now steer away from referenda because after this Catalonian thing, because the zeitgeist today is in favor of populism and nationalism, whereas before it was supposedly left-wing and progressive. But now the left is becoming a lot more elitist, and they want to impose their ideas from above, through censorship and maintain it through censorship and so on. Whereas the popular ideas of today are more inclined to nationalism, yes, and the rediscovery of all those ideas from the late 19th and early 20th century. And a lot of the authors and so on from that period too, poets and so on, even people like T.S. Eliot and, especially somebody like Ezra Pound, of course, I mean, they were all in this sort of patriotic or nationalistic or conservative camp, but they were sort of appropriated by leftists after the Second World War, and this whole picture was presented to us that the world of culture and literature and art and so on, that's all dominated by the left, and there are no right-wing people who have produced anything of value, artistic or intellectual, throughout the ages. Whereas, of course, I'm inclined to, today we're inclined to think it's more of the opposite, that the left just had these sort of ideological projects that have all failed. I mean, communism and multiculturalism and so on. And they've produced these very stylized works that were mostly just propaganda, whereas the more subtle works of art and literature and so on, they came more from the conservative side.
So do you think, I mean, I'm asking you to make an enormous stretch here, and nobody can see the future, but do you think there is a future for what is called here the alt-right, etc., to save the white identity and the nationality of their countries? Or have we gone so far down the rabbit hole of leftist propaganda that we can't bring the world back?
Well, of course, the so-called globalists, they've got very powerful positions in politics and the media and in business and so on. I mean, probably best exemplified by somebody such as George Soros. I mean, he's a billionaire, and he's got his Open Society Foundation that's even got an office in South Africa, and he exerts an enormous amount of influence all over the world. I think he's sort of a puppet master almost, pulling the strings in various countries. But I think it's natural for people to want to associate with others that are like themselves. And that's a natural process, and it's occurred throughout the ages. So I think this natural process that you're seeing in the world today of people coming together and, in any sort of crisis, there is a major global crisis, I think, with all the conflicts going on, the terrorism and the polarization in many societies. And then it's only natural that people should associate with others like themselves, and then you have nations and ethnic groups developing. So, and I think there's enough, thanks to the internet and this whole ferment that's going on social media and on the internet. Thanks to that, the whole movement has got quite a future ahead of it. And, there's a lot of people involved in producing all sorts of things, videos like this one, or books, or studies, articles, and so on. And it's a worldwide thing. It's in all the European countries. It's in the US. I think, probably even Latin America, and even in the Far East. I think Japan has always been a country that has been very proud of its identity, and very exclusive too. They don't really welcome foreigners in their midst. And, the current Prime Minister of Japan, I think he's also, rehabilitated the sort of Japan from the pre-war era, and he's also done quite a few controversial things and made a few controversial statements also, honoring the Japanese who fought in the Second World War, which up until very recently was also a major taboo. So in Japan, I think there's something of a similar order taking place.
So that Dan then leads us kind of backwards to apartheid, because the apartheid structure was for every race and tribe to live under their own rulers, by their own mores, by their culture, and kind of live in peace with each other. It didn't end up like that through many, many reasons, including world pressure. But that was the intention. And while it worked very well. And then the world intervened and said we were wicked and shouldn't do this, and we were oppressing everybody, and it all fell apart. But it looks to me as if the world is beginning to see that system as a necessity in order to maintain or keep your own nationality.
Yes, I think you've got a point there, because, one can even take a step further and say that, under certain conditions, you have to separate people to stop conflict. And ironically enough, a few years ago, there was actually a statement from the United Nations saying that in a lot of these places in the world where you've got conflict between nations and ethnic groups, the only real alternative or the only real solution to stopping such conflicts is to separate those groups. So, and that was precisely what it was about. And then there's another aspect, which I think is also a supreme irony, taking place today or being voiced today. And that is the notion that people in Africa should be allowed to develop in their own areas and in their own countries. And you've had, over the last few months, you've had various European politicians and leaders and people in the EU and so on saying that the Europe solution to this immigration crisis is to actually allow Africa to develop, within its own areas and according to its own culture and so on. And that was precisely the sort of Roottian idea, but in a way it was sort of ahead of its time. Whereas now, the world and Europe and all these politicians are finally coming around to the idea that, maybe just having a sort of an influx of Africans into your society is not such a great thing, and that you should try and create development in the various African countries. And if you substitute the so-called independent African countries for the South African Bantustans, or homelands as they were called, it's exactly the same idea.
And it does work. As you say, that was an idea that was way ahead of its time to a certain extent, but it did work. It kept relative peace instead of trying to push this whole bunch of differing peoples into one homogeneous mass. It kept them separate, gave them their own, I know it's probably controversial to say this, but their own pace of development, instead of trying to force them into a Western culture that they were not ready or willing for. They wanted parts of the...
Well, and a lot of even the more kind of, I don't know maybe the evolved blacks. I mean, the French have this kind of term the evolué, the sort of evolved blacks, the more educated ones. I mean, even people such as Steve Biko, who's now supposed to be a major hero of black thought in South Africa, even they rejected this notion of westernization, that they didn't want to be westernized, that they wanted to remain African, and they were proud of their blackness. I mean, he coined this term, or he popularized this term, black consciousness, that you had to be conscious of your blackness. And together with that went a rejection of Western values, but also of white people in general. I mean, there was a moment in South Africa, I think the 1970s, when you had the very liberal white student organization federation called NUSAS, and the blacks walked out of it. They rejected the left-wing white students to form their own purely black organization. So, apartheid didn't just come from kind of a conservative white side. It also came from the radical black side. And if you read Steve Biko and you read Roodt, I mean, they're sort of two sides of the same coin, as it were. And on very many issues, they perfectly agree. So the whole thing is a lot more complex than it was made out to be.
Yeah.
And I think the Zulu King, the Zulu King a few months ago, he said that he was accorded much more respect under apartheid than he was being accorded now under the current system. And I think the whole traditional kind of African culture and identity and way of life, all of that was promoted in those days. Whereas now, the last 20 years or so, we've seen a lot of that being swept under the carpet, and kind of suppressed, but it's coming to the fore again. I mean, people are, it's sort of, the more you suppress it, the more it will rise again. And today, I mean, a lot of blacks are very much conscious of their own culture and identity, and they want to be Africans, and they want to be Zulus or Tswanas or whatever. You won't get that out of them.
So then that leads us into a lot of the movements worldwide to secede, because we have it here in America. California wants to secede. They are taking a referendum on it. They want to secede from the United States because they feel that they are ultra-liberal and the rest of the states, they don't belong in the rest of it. But then you have the Catalonia one, and you have the secession of the Cape on the 24th of this month. So could you speak about that? Because it's a logical movement of the people who don't want any part of this new world order globalization. It's a natural thing to happen. You were speaking earlier about Catalonia, so could you give your thoughts on that?
Well, yes. I've always followed these countries such or regions such as Catalonia and Flanders and Quebec and so on, and even Scotland. During the Scottish referendum, I was really hoping that Scotland would vote to become independent from the UK, but unfortunately, the majority seems to have, kind of voted with their, with their economic interests and at heart, in mind, and not according to what would be best for them as a people. In Catalonia, I think, as there have always been language issues there between the Catalans and the Castilians, and of course it's a very prosperous part of Spain. I think it represents 22% of the GDP of Spain. So they are net providers to Spain, and so it would be in their economic interest to become independent. And it's a very interesting thing that's taking place there at the moment, because, I mean, obviously Spain doesn't want them to become independent, but the people are pushing for it more and more. And the fact that this, I think, where some of the other states, such as the UK and maybe Belgium too, and even Canada, I mean, they've actually taken a very kind of they've tried to pacify the people in favor of independence. And to a large extent, they have succeeded by actually according them a lot of political and economic and cultural autonomy within the system. In a place like Belgium, there are something like 7 parliaments. And if you look at Quebec today, if you look at Canada, in a lot of respects, I mean, Quebec is a very autonomous province in Canada. I mean, they've got their own, they've got their own language, and they run their own affairs. They've got their own budgets for certain things. And obviously Canada is a federal system, just like Belgium. Now, the Spaniards, they seem to have been taking a bit more of a hard line, although I think Catalonia has also, over the years, become a lot more autonomous, and I think they do have quite a large degree of autonomy within Spain. But this sort of hard line that Spain is taking at the moment, and the violence, and sending in the police to stop this referendum, I mean, that's really just making people more angry and more determined to actually say goodbye to Spain. So I think they've made a major strategic mistake there, and the chances of Catalonia becoming independent are probably greater now than ever before. But now South Africa, as you say, I haven't really, I've met 1 or 2 people involved in this Cape secession idea, but it seems to me that they need a lot more kind of media momentum behind them for it to happen. Yeah, but it's in absolutely. Principle, it's a good idea.
Well, Dan, both Mel and myself, who have been doing this for years, trying to draw world attention to the tragedy of the so-called Rainbow Nation, have been saying since the beginning that when Jan van Riebeeck landed at the Cape, there were no black people there. They were the Khoi.
Yes.
And therefore we cannot return land that we so-called stole from the blacks, because they weren't there to have the land stolen from them. So the fact that the Khoi king has now stood up and said, listen, this land is mine. So far, no further. Enough is enough. This land is mine. I've been accepted by the United Nations. They did the white paper on the rights of the indigenous peoples. Yes. I've been to the ANC government countless times to be accepted as the original people of South Africa. They make promises, nothing happens. They published a thing saying that they could not make the Khoi the right people, because to have 2 nations in 1 nation is unsustainable. So the man has reached a point where his people are not even accepted as a tribe in South Africa. They're a nothing. They have no say in politics. So he just said, look, this has to be done. And he has the absolute international law on his side. But as you say, nobody's touching it. Apart from a very few alternate media outlets, nobody wants to touch this with a barge pole. And without publicity, it's as if it didn't happen.
Yes, I think, one sees also all these contradictions within something like international law, because international law is a lot about international geopolitics, and if you've got one of the major powers behind you, like I referred earlier on to the examples of the Baltic states, and the US supported their independence, and therefore they did become independent. But and in a similar fashion, Crimea, from the moment that Russia decided, they were going to support this movement for Crimea to break away from Ukraine, it happened, and there was even a war fought over that, or but it today it's a fact, or a fait accompli, as they say. But now in South Africa, unfortunately, I think the outside world, they've become wedded to this idea that we should remain within the borders of 1910, that were actually arbitrary too. I mean, if you think about it, there are two independent countries within South Africa named Swaziland and Lesotho. And I mean, both of them are economically and otherwise a lot less viable than the Western Cape, for example. I mean, the Western Cape has got quite a thriving economy. It could be independent. So why not? But I think these movements, sometimes they start small and then they gain momentum, and eventually they become successful. And ever since the breakup, especially since the breakup of the Soviet Union, you've seen a lot of those sorts of movements succeeding, sometimes peacefully, and sometimes even violently. I mean, I'm thinking also of an example like Slovenia, that had, I think they talk about the 10-day war in Slovenia in the early 90s, when they sort of in secret decided that they were going to secede from the old Yugoslavia, and they just on a certain day they put up border posts and so on, and then there was a brief, there were some hostilities that broke out between Serbia and Slovenia, but it only lasted about 6 days and another 4 days of kind of negotiations and so on. And then they were independent. And today Slovenia is an independent country. It's a member of the UN. It's a member of the EU, etc., etc. So these things can happen. I always say that the future is not predictable. And that's why we can also take heart from that, because the future is not going to look like the past, not by a long shot. And even if you'd asked people in 1989, if in 5 years' time the ANC would be ruling South Africa, they would have thought you were insane. They would have said, you must be a lunatic. It will never happen. And yet, 5 years later, due to a concatenation of circumstances and so on, and the actions of certain people and politicians, it did come to pass. But it's not to say that things are going to remain static or that it won't happen in our lifetimes. I think there's just too much pressure at the moment in South Africa for things to remain the same forever.
And I'd like to go there next, Dan, because I think people need to understand why this has become a critical issue. If you look at the picture of South Africa this year, the acceleration of white murders in South Africa this year, the proliferation of black movements like Black Land First, the absolute uproar in Parliament last week with the EFF. I mean, it's become a circus. The state capture by the Guptas and the British element in that. if you take that entire big picture and Zuma's crimes that are just, again, being swept under the rug, is it not time for change? And radical change in South Africa in order to save the minorities that are so badly discriminated against.
Yes, you're perfectly right. I mean, it is time for change. South Africa has gone through a lot of changes over the last 2 decades, but mostly not for the best, but for the worst. And a lot of it isn't working. There's in some respects we're almost a failed state because large parts of the administration and the police, army have become so corrupt that they become dysfunctional. So there is a great need for change and for improving the conditions in South Africa. And definitely any form of, if we could dismantle this kind of centralized structure in South Africa, then minorities would feel a lot more safer and they would have more room to maneuver, to manage their own affairs and to protect themselves and to create, structures and an administration that would care for them. Whereas at the moment, this structure and this state doesn't care for us at all. As you say, it only cares for the kind of Afro-Marxist elite. This notion of the captured state and the sort of Zuma dynasty that we've seen, chances are that Mr. Zuma's ex-wife will take over as the next president. So, some people, I've heard people saying that, she's his ex-wife in name only. That there's still a pretty good relationship between the two. And therefore, it will be almost as if he would continue to rule by proxy. So I think we turning into one of these African countries that is just ruled by one family or one group of people, and that's not democratic at all. So, and the only way of moving away from that is to become more federal or confederal, or to have kind of breakaway parts within the country, and groups gaining more autonomy and a say over their own affairs, because this entire system has been devised in such a way to actually disenfranchise us. If you're honest about it and you look at it honestly and objectively, we've been really disenfranchised, because even the municipal borders have been drawn in such a way that we don't have any say in how our taxes get spent, or how the security system works, or even all these issues around street names and place names and so on. Probably the most salient example of this would be Pretoria. There are about 500,000 white people in and around Pretoria, parts of the East Rand and so on. And they've got absolutely no say in their own affairs, and how their taxes get spent. And all their taxes get spent in other areas to kind of buy votes for the ANC, and now even for the DA, because the DA has essentially just started imitating the ANC, and they're sort of trying to outbid the ANC in giving handouts to their voters. But it's not a good system at all, and it's not leading to progress and development and good governance. We've got bad governance at all levels in South Africa, on the national level, provincial level, municipal level. Some of the municipalities are completely bankrupt. Most of them are probably bankrupt.
And then, Dan, as well, because there are so few white people in South Africa, it is unlikely that it's going to turn around in any way to give you a voice or a say anywhere, because you do not have the numbers to get a vote.
Yes, exactly. We are completely outnumbered. And if you look at how, the demographics have changed since 1960, it's really catastrophic. It's mind-boggling because I don't think even the most pessimistic demographers from that time could predict that the balance would, or the pendulum would swing so badly against us when it comes to numbers. And that's where we are, and we've got to, we must find a solution where we won't be just dominated because we not enough, we haven't got enough people. That principle is not accepted anywhere else in the world. I mean, the Danes are independent from the Germans. I mean, there are 4 or 5 million Danes and 18 million Germans. So, if the Danes can be independent of the Germans, I mean, it's this tiny country just that's actually almost part of Germany because it borders on Germany. Why can't we become independent of Black South Africa?
And this is where I feel that this is possibly the only solution for the dispossessed and disenfranchised white South Africans, because there are approximately 4 million of them and there are approximately 4 million Khoi. You join together, you have a double the voice that you have now, double the power really that you have now. And this thing has been done. It's done. It's over. He's declared it. It's the legalities that are being taken care of right now. And it's been presented to the Constitutional Court. The ANC is carefully not touching it, not commenting on it, because then it didn't happen. And they're hoping, I think, that it'll just go away. But it has been done. And the power of the ANC in this is the media blackout that took place about South Africa in 1994. Once it became the Rainbow Nation, the world turned its back and walked away. Now that this huge historical thing has happened in the Cape, nobody's looking at it because South Africa doesn't exist to the rest of the world. How does one then turn that around? Because we've been trying. Dan, you have spoken all over the world. You practically had to bicycle across Mexico into the US to come and have your say recently. I mean, that was the funniest when you said that at that conference. Yes. I laughed. Okay. I almost had stitches about it, but it's become the truth. I mean, yes. Paul Fromm has been denied a visa from Canada to the United States. Such a thing doesn't exist, but one is demanded from him so that he could come and speak at the same group of people that you were speaking at. So, given that level of anti-white South African and the media blackout, which it's impossible to pierce, to even shine a ray of light on the situation in South Africa. How does one help these people make this public and make the world pay attention? I don't know how to do it.
Well, I think, there's obviously got to be some kind of a media plan and support for it. But the one thing that we have to overcome in South Africa is, of course, that I don't think people are contributing enough funds to these sorts of alternative political and social movements in the country, because they'd rather buy a bigger BMW or,
yes,
a bigger house or something like that. I mean, they're so, wedded to their material possessions and status symbols and so on. And unless we, on a collective basis, start contributing a lot more to making these political projects happen, they're not going to happen, because most of the alternative media and movements in South Africa are starved of cash. And then on the other side, you've got these huge conglomerates, and, a thing like Naspers and so on, which is worth billions of dollars. And obviously they have a monopoly on information in South Africa. And the only thing that we've got is the internet and the social media and alternative media that are not negligible. I mean, they have a lot of influence, but when it comes to legitimizing a certain political project or something like a secession, which is a major thing, then you need some really heavy media behind it, mainstream media preferably. So, that's the problem. And people will have to find ways around that and, come up with some kind of publicity stunt to draw attention to it.
Yep, because you, Dan, have fought your own battles on trying to get the word out. I mean, I have watched you, the travels that you have made, the people that you have spoken to, the prestigious places that you have spoken, and yet it makes pinpricks in the media, and this is a huge thing. The world should have picked up on it, the same as they have in Catalonia, but there is dead silence. And unless we can break through that, as you say, how does one get support for something that people don't know have happened? It's ridiculous.
Well, of course, we're not alone in in fighting an uphill battle like that. Again, I referred to the example of Flanders earlier on, and I've met a lot of the Flemish politicians, in the kind of, in the movement for Flemish independence from Belgium. And they've also been at it for years, and they've had ups and downs and so on. So, and it's not something often that happens overnight, and you have to really put a lot into it. And, it can be a difficult process. If you haven't got a major foreign power behind you or some major media behind you, then it is a difficult process. And I think there's got to be a lot more kind of intellectualizing around these sorts of issues, because that ultimately, if you've got a good argument, then you can take it to the media and you can take it to the international community, and then the thing starts snowballing from there. So, I mean, I haven't looked at all the aspects of this Cape movement, but, no, certainly, far be it from me to criticize it or anything like that. But maybe if they'd done a bit more homework and presented the case, in a bit more detail than they have until now, then perhaps by now it would have drawn a lot more attention. I don't know. I'm not saying that is the case, but I'm just wondering about that.
Dan, in South Africa how one cannot do something like this in the public realm. So all the organizing, planning, putting together had to happen with a huge amount of secrecy. And the planning was in place. Everything is in place. I mean, the organization, the how it's going to work, the We had on Dr. Winston Nagin, who's he's done this for other countries, and he explained exactly the legalities of it and how it has been done perfectly correctly within international law.
Yes.
But one could not go public. And you know yourself that to get a referendum on this going would have taken, well, it would probably not have happened given the political situation in South Africa. So because of the peculiarities of South Africa, this all had to happen underground and then be suddenly become public. And I don't want anybody to doubt that everything is in place. Everything that needs to be in place is in place. We just need even South Africans to become aware of what's happened.
Yes.
But it's so incredibly difficult because there was a little paragraph about this big in the Citizen the day after it happened and nothing else. Nothing else. And the mainstream media in the rest of the world, if they would not speak about the white problem in South Africa, the white poverty, the economic empowerment laws, etc., they wouldn't even look at that. Why would they look at this? And so until somebody is brave enough or not controlled enough to take a look at it and publish it, it's just as if it didn't happen. And I'm somewhat gobsmacked by that because it is a huge event.
Well, one's got to, I quite like the kind of metaphor used by the U.S. investor Warren Buffett. Once he said that you should be out there batting with your baseball bat across your shoulder. I mean, you're not always going to hit a home run, but if you're not going out there and trying, it's not going to happen. So it might not. And if you look at it, I've looked at lots of these independence movements, and some of them, they start off small and then the sort of failures in the beginning, and they are ridiculed. And so, I mean, it could start off with 20 people in a room. I think I can't remember all the details now, the Slovenian example, but I think literally initially there were only about 20 people who supported the whole thing. And from there onwards, it developed, and eventually, it led to the complete independence of the country. So, you've got to start somewhere and then build upon it. And possibly, I mean, it's not, the fact that it's not going to happen overnight isn't a negative. It's just, part of the process that it might take a bit longer. It could take a year or two or even 5. But if you're determined enough, then eventually it will happen.
Yeah.
Because in South Africa, I mean, the state now, it's already, in a way, the South African state has been discredited even by the mainstream media.
Yeah.
They've even acknowledged that it's completely corrupt and in need of a major overhaul. So, you talked earlier about the Rainbow Nation, which was this thing that was created by the mainstream media and the advertising industry. In fact, I think the South African breweries, which is now part of a major, international beer group, or even the biggest one. I mean, they actually gave the whole thing a reason to exist because they spent hundreds of millions on their ads where they showed people in completely artificial situations, black and white and so on, drinking beer together and supporting the Rainbow Nation idea. I mean, they built that whole thing, but ironically, the mainstream media have actually broken down their own creation by focusing on all the corruption and the deficiencies of the current government. So first they presented the ANC as saints,
Yeah.
and now, you know, they're saying that they're not fit to govern the country. So something will have to happen. Now, that's for sure. Well, I see ex-President de Klerk said the ANC was going to implode or something like that, but I'm not too sure about that. But yeah, I mean, even he, who was supposedly one of the architects of the system,
Exactly.
can see that the thing is kind of, I mean, the wheels are coming off.
Yeah. And so that is why this thing it happened now, and it's critical now, because we would like to save some of the country and save all of the people before the wheels fall off totally. And the violence in the country, the protests, the riots, the armed robberies of money trucks, etc., are just, they're a disgrace. They are an absolute disgrace. And the failure of all the parastatals as well, and the bailout of SAA for the fourth time with pension money. It's Mickey Mouse. I mean, this is less than a banana republic, what is going on in that country.
Yes, true. I mean, you know, a lot of people wanted South Africa to become just another, I mean, South Africa used to be a Western country, but now a lot of people wanted it to become an African country or just another African country. And unfortunately that has happened, but in the bad sense, you know, that we've become as corrupt and as inefficient and as a lot of the African countries south of the Sahara, including places like Zimbabwe or Angola or Kenya, so on, you know, and all of them. I mean, there's not a single one that you can really call a raging success. I mean, even Botswana, which is sometimes held up to be a model African republic, I mean, it's also got its problems.
And then again, we have this visit from Mugabe taking place in South Africa yesterday and today. I'm a bit stymied by the time difference, so yesterday and today is good enough for me. And Zuma saying they're like brothers and their countries are the same. And we need to stand together and we support each other. One has to be deaf blind to consider that you're going to support Zimbabwe as a picture of what you want to become.
Yes, exactly. Although, I mean, there was a foreign correspondent from the New York Times in Johannesburg, and she also wrote some eulogies about Zimbabwe and land reform there and so on. So, you know, American liberals are quite capable of that too. But yes, Zimbabwe, I mean, Mugabe has made some extremely anti-white kind of racist statements. You know, there are various video there's video footage on YouTube and elsewhere, where he says basically that whites don't belong in Africa and whites have too much power in South Africa and they should be cut down to size, and that all their possessions should be taken from them, their land and their property and so on. So yes, he's extremely, I mean, he's probably one of the most anti-white politicians in the world, and he's being welcomed in South Africa with open arms.
Yeah, and that is very scary, Dan, because of what his wife did. That whole beating up the model in her son's hotel room, and then being allowed to leave the country under diplomatic immunity, and this buying of a Rolls Royce. I don't know how much it cost her, but I mean it's more money than that could feed Zimbabwe for a while, and keeping it in South Africa. It seems like South Africa is condoning and facilitating the Mugabe's bad behavior and the way that they don't care about their people. And that is a very bad example to set to South Africans, especially with the elections coming up.
Yes, you're right. And I think, the local EFF party, I mean, they've taken their cue from Mugabe. I think Malema, the leader, has visited Zimbabwe a number of times, and I think probably got financial and other support from Mugabe. But you're right that we've actually, facilitated the Zimbabwean regime because it would already have collapsed, I think, if it hadn't been for financial and other support from South Africa. I mean, there would have been a famine long ago in Zimbabwe. Probably they wouldn't have. I mean, as far as I know, we're still supplying electricity on credit to Zimbabwe, whereas they don't have the money to pay for it. So we've actually propped up, I mean, the ANC has propped up the ZANU-PF government in Zimbabwe. If it hadn't been for us, it would have collapsed long ago. So it makes you wonder, I mean, why are they helping this guy if they don't really agree with him in very many respects? And I think even publicly that they do seem to agree with him. And that's very worrying for the Western minority in South Africa, because it creates the impression that, we just gain, I mean, our government is going to follow the same line. And ultimately they just want to get rid of us.
And then I'd like to speak to you, Dan, because this is of severe concern to me. The expropriation without compensation thing. The Boers have a right to their farms. Damn it, man. They've been farming that and providing food for the nation for hundreds of years. And to firstly dispossess them, and then I read this morning that the ANC has got thousands of farms which have been taken back, but they're finding it a problem to give them to the people who claim them, because they don't want the farms, they want the money. So now the farm is not being farmed. The white farm is living in a squatter camp probably, because what is the point? And they can't give the farms away because the blacks who wanted them want the money. And then you have the examples of Sapiko tea estates, and I think it was called Lipton after a while there, and Zebedelia, where they were flourishing export concerns, which are now deserts. So the short-sightedness of this is just beyond me. And in the same breath, Mugabe is saying we're going to get rid of the remaining white farmers, but please will the white farmers come back. So you can't understand which he wants, because it's on the same day, 2 reports from him saying that. So you can't understand where they're coming from. You would think that the ANC government had learned by that example that your country is going to starve if you kill the farmers or chase them away.
Yes, you're right. But the whole thing, I think, is a complete farce. It's, so many contradictions there. You just enumerated a few of them. But we also have to acknowledge at a certain point that, within the African mind, there's no real principle of non-contradiction. You can say something in the morning and the opposite in the afternoon, and that's okay. I don't know whether you've read Peter Mulder's book. He wrote a book in Afrikaans a few years ago, and in it, and then he talks about a certain incident that happens that happened. I think it was between Buthelezi and Zuma or something like that, um, and where the one, I think it was Zuma, who then said yes, but I mean, Buthelezi said something over the weekend, and Peter Mulder thought that on Monday they wouldn't talk to one another in Parliament, but they acknowledged that what he said there was meant for those people at that time to please them. And when he gets to Parliament, then he will say something else, you know. And you've often seen that, you know, when Zuma speaks to the Afrikaners, he's their greatest friend and he's trying to placate them and appease them and reassure them and so on. And then the very next day he would be speaking somewhere else and he would be saying exactly the opposite. So that's a major problem in this part of the world, because you don't really know where you stand. You know, the politicians, they can say one thing the one day in a certain context and something else the next day in another context.
And so, Dan, in their minds, are both of those things true, or does it not matter?
I don't think it matters. You know, the truth is something relative, I think. It's got it's got more of an emotional value than a logical value. It's something that makes you feel good and not something that's necessarily logically true. And a lot of people outside South Africa, you know, in the Western world and so on, they're not aware of these things even, and they take everything at face value. But of course, if you go into it a bit more deeply and you've got more experience of it, you realize that it's very complicated, and some of these things you can't take very seriously. But the whole land reform thing, it's a complete farce, because as you say, you know, about over 90% of the so-called land reform projects and the farms that have been dished out to people, they've all failed. It's cost billions and billions. It's a financial disaster. And yet the government is not prepared to acknowledge that. They just want to continue along the same path until they've actually destroyed our agriculture. And you know, only when there's a famine will they probably realize that they've made a mistake.
What is equally disturbing to me, Dan, is that there are only about 35,000 commercial farms left in South Africa. You know, getting figures out of that country are impossible. So that's what I understand it to be. I could be wrong, but that's what I've read. And of those, 20,000 are on the market for fear of this land redistribution thing. Now, obviously, they're not going to sell them, because no farmer worth his salt is going to go and buy a farm knowing it could be taken away tomorrow.
True.
But the sentiment behind that is very, very frightening, because the country is already no longer a net exporter of food. They're an importer of food. Is it not absolutely visible to the ANC government that this is what they're doing? I can't see how anybody in control of a country can sit by and watch the food source disappearing out the door.
Yes, unfortunately, we've seen this kind of thing happen in Africa over and over. You had in the 1980s a thing in Tanzania which they called Umaha socialism or village socialism, and Julius Nyerere wanted to get the people off the land and into he wanted to urbanize them by force. And that created, and the Scandinavian countries funded that. They gave him billions of dollars to do that. And in the process, he actually destroyed Tanzanian agriculture, and he caused starvation, and they needed food aid. They needed emergency food aid after that. And then we've had the same thing happening in Zimbabwe, where they pushed all the white farmers off the land and they confiscated their property. I've spoken to people like that. And yeah, and now they're going to do exactly the same thing in South Africa. And a lot of, the mainstream media don't seem to take it very seriously. But if you look at what the government officials are saying, what Zuma is saying, they are intent on doing this, on doing this absurd thing. But there's an even more absurd term that's being bandied about at the moment, and of course that's radical economic transformation. If you open a newspaper in South Africa, or you turn on the radio or the television, I mean, I don't watch television, but I assume they also talk about that on TV. People are talking about radical economic transformation, and however you may want to interpret this term, it can only mean some form of Marxist revolution and confiscation of the means of production and all those sorts of things that we've seen in the 20th century in so many communist revolutions. And this is what they are now talking about in South Africa. And even Mrs. Zuma, Dlamini Zuma, who is now campaigning to become the next leader of the ANC and the next president, she's also saying that we must have radical economic transformation. And all of the black commentators and columnists and so on in the newspapers, they're also writing this. We must have radical economic transformation. So how that's going to pan out, that's probably going to, together with the land reform, that could potentially destroy South Africa as we know it. But nobody
is left.
Yeah. But, there's that sort of notion to, I call it radical chic. The American author Tom Wolfe, he wrote a little book, I think in the 70s, called something like Radical Chic and Mowing the Flak Catchers. But there's this idea that when black people do extreme things and they make extreme statements and so on, you don't need to take it seriously. I mean, if a white person would say, I'm gonna confiscate all the property that blacks own and chase them out of the country, then that person would be almost arrested on the spot.
Mm.
And he would be vilified as a Nazi and an extremist and a white supremacist and so on. But if a black person says that, then everybody just smiles politely, and they somehow, they don't accord, the same seriousness to it as they do to a white person saying the same thing, which I suppose, that sort of has to do, I think, with what one might term liberal racism, that ultimately liberals, white liberals, are far bigger racists than conservatives, because they seem to view black people as children, and therefore they don't take them seriously. So if you, it's like a 2-year-old telling you, oh, mommy, I'm gonna kill the neighbors or something like that, and you say, no, that's not a nice thing to say. But we don't take it seriously, or the liberals don't seem to take it seriously.
But Dan, these people have proved themselves to be totally serious. Everything they said they would do, they are doing, to the detriment of the entire country, their own people included. I mean, yes, my focus is on the disenfranchised white people. But if you look at the unemployment figures amongst young Black people, it's shocking, it's horrifying. And they don't care. They just don't care.
Yes, no, you're right. But I saw somewhere the other day that there was some kind of opinion poll that was conducted countrywide among all races. And apparently now for the first time, the majority of South Africans of all races and cultures feel that life was better before 1994 than now. Now, what an extraordinary thing that is, because if you think about the intense propaganda campaign that has been conducted all along to persuade people that the past was so horrific and we were living in this kind of Nazi concentration camp called apartheid South Africa, and it must never happen again, and so on. And despite all of that propaganda and the millions of images and words and so on broadcast to persuade people that the old South Africa was so bad. Now the ordinary man in the street of all races is saying, no, it was actually better. The past was better than the present. And that I find extraordinary. And it shows you that somehow, somewhere, I mean, people still, to some extent, think for themselves. You can't control people's minds. Mind control can never be 100%. It can be 80% or 70% or whatever. But at some level, people still look around them and they start seeing things for themselves, And anybody who had any experience of the old South Africa and comparing it to the new, I mean, he must acknowledge that
it's a mess.
It's a total mess at present, and in the past, very many aspects of the country was quite well run, including SAA. I mean, SAA was a good airline at the time.
Yes.
The management was not corrupt, and it turned a profit, and it provided a good service to all of us. And now it's bankrupt, it's corrupt, it's it has to be bailed out with billions all the time. It's a complete drain on the state coffers. Yeah, that's only one example, and there are many.
You throw SABC into that part next, because they're the next ones. I mean, really, and they control what the people are told or not told.
Oh yes.
So
I mean, the SABC is a major propaganda arm of the government. All the black radio stations broadcasting in African languages. That's where the real mind control takes place. And they have to control that.
Mm-hmm. So Dan, we have about 5 minutes left, I think between 5 and 10 minutes left. If you have some closing thoughts, particularly on the secession, because I feel this is a very big thing for South Africans. It could provide a safe haven for white South Africans if we help to make it a success. And isn't that what they have been calling for the last 20 years?
Yes, I think a lot of people have been talking about self-determination and, finding some corner of the country where we could do our own thing and live a more or less ordered and peaceful life and not be subjected to violence and attacks and home invasions, farm attacks and farm murders and all those sorts of things. So I think it's inevitable that things will develop in that direction. because this current system can't continue like this forever. It's just, I use the expression, the wheels are coming off, and you can see it. I mean, it's everywhere. The administration is not functioning. I mean, there are potholes in the roads and so on. And just financially, you can see that it's not viable in the long run. So we'll have to develop some corner of the country for ourselves, and it's probably going to be towards the Western Cape, either the Southern Cape or Western Cape, that region, because that's where the part of the country with the least African blacks, and therefore it's the most suitable for Western settlement and development, even though it might not have all the mineral resources of the northern parts of the country, but we'll have to do without those, and develop those areas for tourism and agriculture and high-tech industry and software and services and so on. I think the Cape Town is already a very successful city, and it's growing faster than a lot of the other cities in South Africa as a result of the spontaneous influx of white people and capital in the Western Cape. And I think that process is bound to continue.
And we can do it, Dan. We can do it. We as a white South African nation, together with...
Yes. Yes, we can, because, apart from the mines that have never really belonged to us,
yes,
but the rest of the country we developed by picking up ourselves by our own bootstraps, through hard work and initiative, and not with a lot of capital at all, did we develop the country and turn it into an industrial country. So we can do it again. It's quite possible. Just like Germany and Japan stood up after the Second World War, and within 10 years became two of the major industrial powers in the world.
Yes.
I mean, we can do the same thing here. Under proper leadership, we can within 10 years create a new South Africa, or a new country,
yes,
that will be highly prosperous and successful,
yes,
and developed, and an example to the world and to Africa as well, because not all the Africans are, socialists and Marxists and so on. I mean, a lot of them have seen and are aware of all the failures on the continent, and they also want to see proper development taking place, and they also acknowledge that whites or people of European descent can play a leading role in creating prosperity and economic development on this continent, like we always have.
Yeah. And I love the name of it. I know it was the Cape of Good Hope, but the Nation of Good Hope is just such a fitting name, because it will give hope to people around the world who are suffering the same things that South Africa suffered. An influx of brown people, disenfranchising them, slaughtering them, raping them, etc., etc. It will give hope to them that we can stand up again, and we can make a success of a country again for ourselves. If we just all stand together, we can do this.
Yes, those are fine sentiments. I cannot help but agree with you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you very, very much for coming on the show again. We will be calling on you very regularly.
Okay, well, I think I've got some of the technical problems sorted out now, because I use a Linux system, and fortunately
it doesn't like Zoom.
No, but this is running on it now at the moment.
Wow.
So Yeah, I'll kind of refine the lighting and all that a little bit, and then we can, we can do a few more
Thank you. I'd really like
chats
to
like
thank
this.
you, Dan, because I know you're a very busy man and you're very much in demand by all and sundry. But I like the quiet, intellectual, not emotional driven voice that you add to the discussion. Because I'm way too emotional about it. I get terribly worked up and, and you just add a calmness to it, which is really great. So thank you very much for being our guest.
Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to our next talk.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's been great to have you with us. Very, very eye-opening, as always, your information. And that's it for us tonight, guys, on Stop South African Genocide. Please do tune in for next week's edition, same time, same place, with myself, my co-host, Karin Smith. As always, it has been a pleasure. For those of you wanting to catch up on our archives, please check out consciousconsumernetwork.tv for our broadcast guide, ccn.media for the archives, and of course, stopsouthafricangenocide.org to get all the information with regard to South Africa. And of course, you can catch Karin's stuff at radiofreesouthafrica.com. And Dan, where can people find you?
Yeah, well, they can find me on Twitter and Facebook, and of course on praag.org, praag.org. My email address is also there. So yeah, it's quite easy to contact me.
Brilliant. All right, that's it for tonight, folks. Thank you for tuning in. It's been a pleasure. We'll see you again. Take care.
Good night.
If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire, the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.